Today we're going to talk about, because I think with social class, it's like a lot of things. I think we have a tendency to assume that by and large, the division between people, right, in terms of class divisions has been pretty constant, right? They're basically the same throughout history. And there's actually like very drastically different ways in which people of different social classes orient towards one another that has pretty great impacts for how people live. One thing that, as we talk about this, and this is something that in general, like regardless of what we're talking about in this class, sometimes thinking about things in terms of whether they're good or bad is not always useful. And I think that's very true if we're talking about social classes and different ways in which social inequality is basically like constructed as a society. In some ways, they're all kind of bad. In some ways, they all have benefits to them, to the people who suffer from inequality. So we're going to kind of look at that, look at in particular the transition into modern social class. And we're also going to kind of point to where social class has been going, particularly since the 1970s. The way in which we, different groups of people relate to one another change. And we're going to see, or at least arguably has changed. There's debates about whether we live in the modern or not. And I think I've said this before, because we throw the word modern around, a lot of times people just use it to mean contemporary. When I use the word modern, does anybody remember, did I say this before, what I mean by modern? Does anyone remember what sort of like, what time period we're looking at?
Didn't you say like post-1600s or something?
Yeah, if you generally think of it, and that's like a very fuzzy, like, it's not that hard of a line in the sand, but if you generally think about it as like 1600 as sort of the start of modernity, I think that's pretty useful. And so what we're going to see is we're going to see that coming out of the Middle Ages, social class greatly changes, right, which has implications for how we work today, what work life is like in particular. So before I start this, I just want to point out that most of this lecture comes out of Marxism. You guys are probably familiar with the term Marxism. How are you familiar with it? Because it's probably used a little differently in academia than it is high school, etc. What do you associate with the word Marxism?
Karl Marx.
Well, yeah, Karl Marx, yeah, right?
Obviously.
Founder of Marxism, yeah, that's a good starting point, yeah. All Marxism grows out of Karl Marx, so yeah, that's very true.
We tend to associate with the government sort of been modeled after his theories.
Yeah, we have a tendency to particularly associate it with communism, right? Which it's debatable whether communism actually is modeled after Marx. It's a whole like long theoretical debate about something called vanguardism. This is the point. The point being is that in academia, generally Karl Marx is just treated as a really important philosopher from the 19th century. So like you'll find it's very common, especially in the humanities and the social sciences, to have a lot of things built off of the work of Karl Marx. There's also, you could arguably say that Marx has kind of like two careers. He has one as sort of a popularizer of a political movement, and he has another as a philosopher and economist. And in academia, we pull to the latter. So it's more like something that Marx gets us thinking about, really importantly gets people thinking about, is how do we understand social class as something dynamic and changing over time, right? So thinking about this lecture is very specifically kind of grows out of that, right? How is it that Marx is displaying to us this change? Right? And this change is central to Marx. It's also, this shift to modernity is also pretty central in terms of sociology and how it understands the world in general. That what came before and what we live in now is actually quite novel and different. Which has kind of come through already somewhat. So to get us kind of thinking about this, I think we all kind of have like some vague understanding of what the Middle Ages is like from like watching movies, whether they're like fantasy movies or actually take place in the past. And so I want us to get a spitballing about like what kind of jobs people have and how that might fit in with their class structure. And then we'll see how the jobs that we have today and how they fit in with a very different system. So what kind of things did people do in the Middle Ages? What's some of our images of what people might do?
A lot of agriculture, farming, animal raising for lower class and higher class, who were their dukes or lords, knights.
Yeah, so we got a couple of classes already popping up there. So we could talk about nobility, also sometimes called the aristocracy. And then we have the peasants. Who farm. Okay. So one thing to get us thinking about it is, so what kind of work, or does the nobility or the aristocracy, the people who kind of govern the place, right? Kings, all the minor stuff down to lords. There's actually one more group of people that are nobility. We'll get to that in a second. What do they make their money from? Does anybody know? Or want to guess?
Don't they like, they own land, and the people who work on their land are paying taxes or something to live on their land or something?
Yeah, and that's exactly right. So primarily what they do is they own land. Right, that's where they get their money from. And they extract tribute is usually the language that gets used, from the peasants, right? What other sort of things do aristocrats do? There's a couple other jobs.
Well, if they're higher up there, like a lord or a duke, they govern the land.
Yeah, and actually, as a general rule, they're the government, right? All the way up to kings. By the way, do kings have very much power in the Middle Ages? Do people know this? Do kings have very much power in the Middle Ages? No, not really. They're actually pretty weak. Generally, power is decentralized during this era. So, but yes, they own land, they're the government. One other thing. This is also just a stock symbol of the Middle Ages. It's one other thing that people from the nobility sometimes do. On horseback, shiny armor. Knights, yeah, they're the military. Yeah, they're knights. Okay, so how does being a peasant differ from being a farmer? What do you think? It's not the same job completely, right? What can farmers do with their land that peasants can't? That's
Can they sell their land?
they can sell their land, yeah. Peasants, they don't own their land, they can't sell it, they live on it. Now they have complete and unilateral rights over using their land. So you can't take land away from peasants, right? You can't, regardless of how bad of farmers they are, their children will still be allowed to live on that land. It still gets passed, right? So but the peasants are tied to the land. How are we going to spell the word tied? Somebody help me out. T-I-E. I have real problems with I and E from learning German. I never know which way to place them anymore. Anyways, because it's flipped. Yeah. So peasants, yeah, peasants are tied to the land. There's some other important differences to understand. So the relation, particularly with the relationship between the nobility and the peasants, is unlike what exists today often with between upper class and lower classes, there's something called paternalism. Which means that basically the nobility have a responsibility, and there's a lot of like very set obligations that they have towards the peasants. And these are things like what they have to take care of, what they have to give them in terms of housing, how much they have to pay them for grain is usually set in advance. And there's also like things like the commons. They maintain lands that peasants can use any way they want that nobody owns. None of them own. So these are things like you can go, you know, chop down a tree or go hunt on them or whatever, right? You can use anything on those lands for free. So anyway, so these are two of your major classes. What other groups of people do you get in the Middle Ages?
Are the serfs, are those considered in the peasant category?
Serfs are generally peasants, yeah. And serfdom is actually like a name for this system. And there's differences too. This is a very like, we're talking about thousands, you know, quite a few hundred years of history, right? So, 1,000 years, over 1,000 years.
Clergy?
You do get clergy, yeah. Clergy have a weird position in the class structure of the Middle Ages. That's not really very comparable to here, to our class structure now, because they're pulled from all the classes. So you can send, if you're a peasant, you can send your kids to be clergy, and they will be. They'll be a monk. You can obligate them, right? So like they're kind of a weird category. I'm just going to put a question mark by. They're also very powerful in some ways. In a lot of ways, you can also consider clergy as where you actually get social mobility in this system, right? So you can end up with, a monk as a child, end up, fairly high up in the church and actually be from non-aristocratic blood, and then actually, have militaries own lands. A lot of the clergy in the Middle Ages own their own land and stuff as well. Okay, not technically they don't own it, but they do. Okay, any other groups of people? There's two more, one of which I don't expect you guys to get. What else can you do? So you can farm, or you can ride around on horseback and hit people with sticks. What else can you do? Just looking for guesswork. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know the name specifically, but like merchants, marketplace sellers.
That was the one I didn't expect anyone to get. Yeah, you can be a merchant. What do merchants do? What's that? Did you say something?
I just said merchant.
Yeah, what do merchants do?
They sell goods.
Yeah. Sell, they import, right? Import, export. This group is going to be very important. At the time, there's actually a lot of tension between the nobility and the merchants, and the nobility kind of forced the merchants down in the Middle Ages. If merchants get too rich, they might get killed, etc., etc. So, like, it's kind of a dangerous position to be in. And it's also thought of as being really, like, kind of a ignoble, sort of like, kind of skeezery profession in the Middle Ages. Mainly because of religious attitudes towards wealth. So the clergy are often the merchants are often kind of looked down on in society. They're kind of seen as pariahs in the Middle Ages. Okay. Which is very different from our own society, right? Where we actually kind of like often look at those activities with love of praise. And we'll see kind of the history of that here today. So. Okay, there's one more group of people.
Like kings and stuff. Like kings and queens and all that.
They're up here.
Like, what about marauders, like pirates or something?
Oh yeah, they're those. I don't think of that.
The rich and
That's interesting, yeah. Yeah, a lot of those come from outside, so that's part of it. And then sometimes they're just people from various different classes. Sometimes they're people who lost their rank and title. Sometimes they're, you know, people who got fed up with being peasants, became mercenaries instead.
Where does this final, what we call it, rank in the system?
Well, I was looking for the artisans, right? So like people who make things, the artisan class. Does anybody know, has anybody ever heard of a guild? This is really important in this time period. What's a guild? I saw some nods. Anybody want to?
Well, there's usually a certain, like in art, there's a master and like they have like apprentices who are supposed to mimic what the master like does.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's
like
how
that.
that's how you would learn your gilded profession, is you'd have to study under somebody who's granted the title of master. The guild would grant that title to master and set you up with that. Anything else that guilds do that people are familiar with?
So it's not really like a union, I mean, kind of is, but it's more like, it's like an organization of older people, and it kind of sets your standards, so you have a standard now, you know.
Yeah, yeah, that's what they set the standards, and they set the pricing. You can't sell things for below or above what the guild tells you you can. And it's going to be gradated by quality, right? So if you make a really, like, I don't know, you're a metalsmith and you make cups, and you make one really fancy cup with one really bad cup, there'd be different pricing for those, but they set the different pricing on is to be determined by the quality. Prices on everything are stagnant in this system. They don't go up and down a lot. You have to like basically create new sort of like governmental agreements to actually have pricing change. Same thing with what the peasants owe the nobility in terms of tribute, right? All this is actually pretty set in stone. So it's not like now we're used to prices constantly like flying up and down. It just doesn't happen in this system. It's a lot more rigid. So yeah, that's what the guilds do. Where do people who are artisans generally work? What do you think?
Let's say like in the city, but like not part, kind of more on the outskirts of the city.
Oh, I didn't mean like geographically. I meant like what kind of place of business? It's either, oh, go ahead.
Blacksmiths, potterers, maybe painters.
Yeah.
Carpenters maybe?
I'm not looking for the type of job. I'm looking for like literally where do you think they work?
Like in a warehouse, or?
Yeah, like that, yeah.
They work in their own house. Right?
Yeah, there's certainly a cottage industry. Or they may have a workshop outside of their own home, but they generally own it, right? One of the artisans owns it. You know, so it's not, there's no third party owning what's going on. That becomes really important in our later class discussions. So, okay. So there's our medieval system, class system. So what kind of jobs do people do now? I'm going to write some names to start out here. Then we'll plug things into it. So I'm going to use Marxist terms for class because they work a little differently. How do we often think of class categories in the United States now? Like what would be our social classes?
Like lower poverty, and then like lower middle class, upper middle class, and upper class.
Yeah, so it would be like, you know, we'd have lower class, working class, middle class, upper class, and then some divisions within that, right? Like ways of ranking it. It's basically off of what? What determines your social class, usually in that system?
Wealth?
Yeah, it's literally, well, not wealth, it's literally like income, right? How much I bring in. Wealth would be like how much I possess, There's a distinction there. This is literally like, how much income do I bring in a year is often how we define that. In Marxism, it works a little differently. Like your class is determined by the job you do. So, so the major two classes in Marxism is the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And I'm sure we will have other ones that come up. So what kind of work can people do today? What kind of work do people do? What do people do for a living? We can also by the end discuss whether Marx's system actually works anymore. Yeah.
They do like blogging or like YouTube, like social media stuff.
Yeah, it's funny. That was like one of the first things that came up last time. Okay, so that would actually be a different category here. So we'll define these later on. But this would be essentially something called a petite bourgeoisie. Petite bourgeois. Anyways, I'll just define it. I don't think this is working out. So for bourgeoisie, essentially, it's called the owning class, basically. So it's the people who own like large businesses, right? So for today, based upon like what a little bit more modernized than Marx, what does that mean? What do they make most of their money from if they're the owning class? How do you own things nowadays, usually, especially bigger companies? We kind of nodded at this in last class as well. Where do you buy a company, part of a company?
Market?
The stock market. So people who primarily make their money out of the stock market, is through owning or as like CEOs of companies, heading boards, right, things like that. For companies, they would be here, right? They would do that kind of job. In a lot of ways, they're the only ones who are kind of there in this system. So the petit bourgeois is like you own stuff, but generally speaking, you don't have like tons of people working for you or anything. You kind of just own your own. This would be like people who like own a storefront, right? Own a little store or shop someplace. They might have a few employees, but by and large, they just kind of own their own ability to work, you know? So, and talking about like gig economy kind of stuff, like I make my money, you know, being a YouTube promoter, right? I was surprised how big of an industry this is, because like I started putting up my videos, and you know how many, I get about, I don't know, 10 or 15 emails a day now, or a week, not a day, 10 or 15 emails a week by people who just leave like messages on my bottom being like, hey, do you want to stop getting messages from me? Then you should talk to me about like, you know, like basically like getting your videos out there. It's like, that's really annoying. I don't want my videos out there. They're just for my students who can't show up. Anyways, so yeah, that's all. That stuff is all sort of like that's all would all be kind of petit bourgeois. It's pretty rare to own your own. And there's one other class of people. Usually in the United States, farmers are this. Like farmers own their own means of production. That's the phrase that gets used. They own their means of production. Do most people who work have their ability to own their business that they work for? What do most of us do? We work for somebody else. And that's essentially what makes somebody proletariat in this system. The proletariat works for someone else. This would be true. This is true whether you're middle class. This is true whether you're working class, right? What's the significance of working for somebody else rather than yourself?
you're working for yourself, you take on all the risk, but if you're working for someone else, you're not necessarily taking on the same risk as an employer.
Yeah, so you might be, you take on more risk in some ways if you work for yourself. What else is a difference?
Steady income, if you're working for someone else usually.
You get steady income if you work for somebody else. I'm going to venture this, and this is something we often don't think about. How much control do you have over your work life if you work for yourself versus somebody else?
Too much. You can kind of like control your hours, like facilitate yourself.
Yeah, you can control your hours. You can also control how you work. What your product is, right? Whatever, right? You have control over those things when you work by yourself. This is a very significant thing within. So, and that's because you own your own ability to work. To some degree, you get to make decisions about how you're going to work. As a general rule, do people today get to make decisions of how they're going to work? No. You simply kind of plug into an existing system. This is often referred to in Marxism, by the way, as alienation. Has anybody ever heard that term as alienation before? When we say that you're alienated, it essentially means that you feel disconnected, right, from. The word actually comes from the word foreign in the original German. So like, it's like you, which, you know, is kind of connected to the word alien in English, right? So it's like you make something that should be familiar to you foreign, right? It's alienation. So the idea is it's sort of like, at one point when you worked, you were very connected to the products you made, right? So, you know, if you're an artisan, you essentially had a lot of control over and were very connected to the products you made, right? You made them from beginning to end. Nobody stood over you and told you you could or couldn't do this with it, right? Essentially, you had some sort of control because you worked at home and you controlled how you made things, right? In the same way, like peasants, they didn't have necessarily a lot of control over their lives, but they did have control over how they worked, right? The lords don't know anything about farming. They don't really care about farming. They're not agriculturalists, right? Instead, they're just people who own that land, and the peasants are the ones who kind of like actually control what they do, right? Does that make sense? So for Marx, we kind of moved into this system where we don't control things anymore, right? Where we become alienated from our lives. Okay. There's one other category of class, and they're typified by not working or not working a lot. So this is, you all just play it, this is working class and middle class. Because the working class isn't necessarily a poor person. The last class, if we're to use Marxist terms, is the lumpen proletariat. Most people would just call them lower class. All right. Okay. So, how do we, is that, now I want us to think, how do we get from here to there? Right? How do groups change? So, first of all, I want to venture, does anybody know what happened to the nobility?
Eventually, they just kind of got overthrown.
Yeah. Who overthrew them?
Peasants.
No, not the peasants. The peasants aren't in charge. The merchants. Right? If you think about, like, what were... So, this is in Marxism. When did this happen? We all know when the aristocrats got overthrown. When did it happen here? In the United States, good old US of A. What happened? When did we, yeah, the American Revolution. What happened in Europe? Similar revolutions, right? French Revolution, et cetera, et cetera. All with their own kind of individual history, but taken collectively. Marxism usually refers to this as the bourgeois revolution. And if you think about the leaders of that revolution, what did they do for a living? What were they? What's that?
Importers, exporters, sellers, merchants.
Yeah, they were all in like sort of the upper professional class. Most of them owned something, right? They were newspapermen. They were, they owned law offices. They were merchants. They owned plantations, right? Whatever it was, right? They came from this sort of class, and essentially they became the ones who overthrew the nobility. And this is sort of like the birth of the upper class as we know it today, right? Once again, like Marx isn't necessarily going to say this is a bad thing, right? This is just kind of the history of social class, right? So essentially the nobility, they essentially have to flood into one of the other social classes as they move forward. A fair number of them manage to become bourgeoisie, right? Not all of them. Sometimes they kind of go into professional classes, right, in various ways. That would be called white collar, but nonetheless, within 100 years of the bourgeois revolutions, there is no such thing as aristocrats. This also undoes all of these relationships, right? So the people are no longer tied to the land. You no longer have commons. We no longer have big tracts of land that we can just use however we want. Everything is held privately, right? So there's the closing of the commons. Nobody's guaranteed set rates. And so that's essentially what happens. There's also a big transformation in some ways amongst the rest of these professions. And this all has to do with what do you sell? So if we think of this older system, what are people selling? What do artisans sell?
Household necessities like, bowls, utensils, furniture, I don't know, just things that people use every day.
Basically whatever they make.
They sell objects. What do peasants sell? Peasants still have to sell stuff, right? Like they just pay tribute to the lords. They don't work for them. What do they sell?
Food.
They sell grain, yeah. They sell what they grow. They sell objects. They sell things, if you will. Do any of you make things that you sell? What professions are you guys looking to go into? Will you make something will you sell something you make? What do you sell?
Services.
Yeah, services works.
Labor,
Yeah, you sell your work. You sell your labor. Services is kind of like labor, right? Like, I think it's a comparable term, right? What else do you sell? What do you have to do? Anybody here have like a menial job, like some sort of job that they just use to make money right now because they're in college?
I mean like, post office, like I work at the mail.
So you work at the mailroom. What do you do when you show up at the mailroom?
I clock in, I take packages, bring packages out to people,
What do you do at the end of the day?
I clock out.
So what do you sell other than your work?
Your time.
Your time. Pretty much nobody sells things anymore, right? Which, like we said before, like there's a certain lack of risk to that, right? But there's also like a certain lack of control that comes out of that too, right? We have to do what other people tell us to when we're for a set number of hours, right? There's also is a certain insecurity to our system, and it kind of works like this, like what determines where you fall in this system? What determines which class you're in?
Your parents or your class partner.
Yeah, what you were born into. What determines what class you're in here?
Where you work?
Yeah, what determines where you work?
Oh, the government.
Kind of chance, right? So that's kind of, so there's a certain insecurity that like, here there's a lot of guarantees, right? It's not always pleasant, right? But by and large, people's livelihoods are kind of guaranteed. Here, there are no guarantees, right? So in this way, like our system actually ends up being a lot more risky rather than a lot less risky in some ways too. Make sense? Cool. Any questions or thoughts so far? Everybody on the same page? So, now we're going to do the opposite and ask, do people know how, so, you know, Karl Marx, strong thinker, wrote almost 200 years ago. So, I don't think we can just like own his class structure as existing anymore, right? Like, so my question is how might this system be different than what we experience now? What do most people do for money in the mid-1800s, mid to late 1800s?
More menial labor.
Yeah, most people are doing working class labor. And where are they doing it?
Factories.
In factories. Alright. You do the Y or the IE? Okay, cool. Wonderful. Yeah, working in factories. How many people nowadays in the United States work in factories? Not very many. Why did that? What changed? People know this?
Technology?
What's that?
Technology?
It's not primarily technology that replaced it.
A lot of factories are like outside businesses.
Yeah, we outsource our factory jobs. This really started in the late 70s, but really kind of hit in the 1980s. So how did the class structure of the United States change from that? What do you think?
We started selling kind of like our intellectual, like, it became more of a thing to have skilled laborers than unskilled laborers.
Yeah, so you do get some of the working class shifting to the middle class. It does happen. And this is where we talked about like the service economy was a big term that was in the 80s. People talked about transitioning to a service economy. What do you think most people who are in the working class ended up?
White collar jobs?
No, most didn't end up in white collar. Most of the working class ended up in the working poor, right? So, this was referred to as the era of deindustrialization. During deindustrialization, we saw the death of the working class. Which maybe death was a bit dramatic when they called it that, because there still are working class people, right? But by and large, very few people compared to what they used to do are working class, right? Okay, does anybody know what's currently happening with the middle class?
Isn't it growing?
The middle class is shrinking. And it's largely because of the same process. So currently in the United States, we are starting to outsource a lot of our middle class labor, right, to other countries. So currently the middle class is shrinking. There's also, because there's less affluency because of the death of the working class, a lot of the people who transitioned into the service economy, a lot of the service economy is also disappearing. So you get, the outsourcing of middle class labor. You also get things like, a lot of your stores are closing, like any sort of brick and mortar industries is kind of shutting down. So this is largely leading now to sort of the death of the middle class. And pretty much anything you can think of in terms of middle class work is starting to move overseas. So this could be things like a good example of this would be even something like being a doctor, right? A medical doctor. Has anyone ever heard of teledocs? It's the major thing attached to a lot of people's insurance. I saw a couple people. Has anyone ever used this? Now, a lot of insurance now requires you, before you go to a doctor, to call this hotline that essentially connects you with a doctor in some other country at a discounted rate to prescribe you prescriptions so that you don't have to go to the doctor. Right? I used this once for strep throat. I got strep throat. This is my last insurance. My insurance here, I don't have to do this anymore, which I'm pretty happy about. But my last insurance, I had to call somebody. I got somebody from Southeast Asia who prescribed me medicine for my strep throat without ever looking at it, right? So on and so forth. So that's an example of like work that once would have been done by medical doctors in the United States has slowly gotten outsourced, which means that in some ways, like the need for that will dissipate over time, right? A lot of your data analysis work that companies do now is outsourced. Things like telemarketers, not that anybody likes telemarketers, or call centers, right, are largely being done other places, right? So we're slowly getting the same thing that happened to the working class happening to the middle class. The middle class is currently shrinking. A lot of people who started out middle class, even people who are, and this isn't to be like depressing to you guys, but even people who are college educated often end up no longer being in the middle class by the time they're in their 30s and 40s. That's been the first time that's been true is for millennials, so people my age. But you guys aren't millennials. You guys are what comes after. Okay, well that makes sense. Any questions or thoughts, people? Okay, so this ends our, and don't pack up quite yet. This ends our sort of like centered around one place form of talking about inequality. Now we're going to talk about global inequality. So we're going to mostly be talking about inequality in other countries and kind of the things that contribute to that. So that's going to be the next week. Okay, have a good weekend. Have fun. Be safe. See you guys.